Hello, I hope you're doing well. In the previous video, in the previous lecture, we talked about the emergence of neoliberalism in the 1970s onwards, and how the emergence of neoliberalism changed the global political economic structures. One of the things that we said about what neoliberalism did was that neoliberalism attempted to create, or its goal was to create a world that is ruled by the markets and protected by governments. So in today's video, what I want to talk about is one case in point in which you could see the ramifications of that goal that neoliberalism had. The ramifications of what it means for governments or to live in a global economy, in a global political economic structure in which governments are disciplined by the power of the market, or living in a system in which the global marketplace could discipline and could constrain governments to force them to do what the markets want them to do, and by markets I mean those who prevail in the global marketplace. Today we're going to talk about what happened to Greece in 2015 as a way of kind of understanding the ramifications of the neoliberal transformation of capitalism that produces this new epoch of capitalism that we could call global capitalism. So one of the things that we said that happened as a result of neoliberalism is that production, for the first time in human history, has become transnationalized, meaning that the assembly lines that used to be constrained or contained within the borders of the nation state have now been disintegrated and moved all across the world, and so that we produce stuff in a global fashion. As a result of that, we said that what we had observed up to the 1970s, which was that the global economy was divided into a geographic core and periphery, in which some spaces in the global economy produced manufactured products and some spaces within the global economy produced raw materials. That system is going to shift. So before, the inequality in the world was structured around this geographic lines in which core countries had a lot more money and periphery countries had no money. And the reason why there was this kind of gap in wealth was because the system produced that. Well, as a result of neoliberalism and as a result of the transnationalization of production, that inequality that before was structured geographically in terms of core countries and periphery countries dissipates, because now the process of manufacturing doesn't just take place in core countries, it takes place globally, including in periphery countries. This has meant that now inequality is no longer geographically structured, but rather socially structured, so that we are able to see massive poverty and impoverishment in what was formerly core countries, and we could also see a small number of uber wealthy people in the former periphery countries. So that the inequality has now become increasingly social. We could see inequality in the same place. We don't need to travel thousands of miles away or to move to different countries to see differences between different countries. So the image that I have here is a classic image of a neighborhood in Brazil, and what you see on the one side is this picture of this apartment building that seems very nice, and look, it has all kinds of amenities. Every floor, every balcony has this kind of jacuzzi or pool area. There's also this larger pool and tennis courts. if you just looked at this picture on this side, this is of a picture of luxury. However, this luxury building is right next to slums or informal housing on this side. And what divides them is just simply a wall, so that you're able to see uber rich next to a massive poverty at the same time. This is true now. I mean, you could look even in our city, in Long Beach, in Los Angeles, that wealth is literally next to impoverishment. That you see people who have no homes and are forced to sleep in tents and in informal housing right next to or very close to areas that are super rich and super wealthy. In the previous lecture, I showed you pictures of dilapidated buildings that are rusting away, of factories that are rusting away in places like Detroit and Baltimore in the United States, and super luxurious malls in places like Cairo and South Salvador. So that, again, this inequality is moving from geographically to socially. Well, one of the ramifications of this is that as this transnational economy leads to increased polarization, what it also produces, what it brews, what it facilitates is tension, is social tension, is resistance that could emerge out of popular classes resisting or pushing back against this kind of the social inequality that is rampant. Well, if this is a problem, this question then, agents of this global economy, those who are interested in promoting this global economy, have to figure out, how do we deal with the tensions that are going to emerge from below, the resistance that is going to emerge from below? How do we circumvent that? How do we push against that? This is what I want to talk about. And so one of the things that I'm going to explain today is one of the responses that they have to this is going to be the creation of economic institutions that are autonomous from and buffered from political accountability. And so this group of those who support this global economy are going to transform the state so that the state, which previously was contained within it, the state oversaw both political and economic institutions. That formation is going to be transformed so that now the state runs political institutions, but economic institutions are increasingly semi-autonomous from, or relatively autonomous from, or semi-independent from the power of the state. And economic institutions that become increasingly independent from the state start to work with, on behalf of, and for, in relationship with global market forces. So that economic institutions, so in the case of the United States, things like the Treasury Department or the Federal Reserve, is going to work in conjunction with and respond to global market forces and global market relations, as opposed to working in conjunction with to the state. So that global market relations or global market forces are going to be able to influence these economic institutions that will make economic policies for society, for the state, as opposed to the state having power over the economic institutions to make policies that will then govern global market relations. So this is going to be a strategy in which we're going to make economic decision making that is going to be outside of the ability of people to have influence over those decision making structures. This is going to be a strategy to deal with the resistance that might come from below to respond to increasing inequality. And as a result of this, the state is going to be increasingly susceptible to the disciplining power of the market. And these two things occur because what's going to be pushed ideologically is that the economy is an objective science, like physics, that is outside the terrain of political struggle. That they're going to argue when it comes to economic policies, these are things that are not political questions, but rather scientific questions or mathematical questions. 1 + 1 = 2. You cannot argue about what 1 + 1 is. It's just 1 + 1 is 2. And if and you need mathematicians to understand math. So this is not a place to have opinions and debates. They're going to argue that the same thing goes for the economy. That's why the economy should not be part of the state and be susceptible to political negotiations, political wranglings, or protests. It needs to simply respond to global market forces. So I want to show you this process. I want to show you what this meant for a place like Greece, to be able to see how this kind of plays out in the so-called real world. The main argument of my presentation today for you is that the democratic demands are being subverted by politically unaccountable, transnationally oriented elites who wield political and economic power. That I'm going to argue that your ability to influence economic decision making, and by you I mean you as everyday people, and your attempt to make democratic demands from politicians about economic policies are going to be undermined or subordinated to the will of, to the interests of, to the demands of transnationally oriented elites who are going to now have economic and political power over you. And thus, I'm going to ask, what is happening to the notion of citizenship? And do we still retain the rights of citizens, or are we being increasingly being transformed to become subjects? Not of kings, but this time subjects of global investors. So this is what I'm going to try to argue is going on by showing you what happened in Greece in 2015. In 2015, what was very common on the streets of Athens was massive protests. And in the years even leading up to 2015, the scenes of protest and altercation between protesters and police officers and riot police was very common. Here is one of these days, one of these incidents of protests. So these are protests that are happening. These are altercations between people who are against austerity policies or policies of cuts to government spending, fighting against police officers and riot police on the streets of Athens. So what I want to figure out and what I want to talk about today is what led up to these scenes on the streets of Athens. So the story of these protests goes back to the attempt of Greece to enter into what's called the Eurozone. The euro is the currency of the Eurozone. In fact, what makes the Eurozone is the grouping of countries that use the euro as their currency. And these are 19 countries, 19 of the 28 countries that are part of the European Union. So the European Union has 28 countries. Out of those 28 countries, 19 of them decided to enter into a monetary union where all of them use the euro as their currency that is issued by the European Central Bank as opposed to the central bank of their own countries. So they've relinquished some sovereignty or some control over the economy by entering into this monetary union. Now, in order to qualify to be part of this single currency, every country had to abide by certain conditions. These conditions included things like a debt to gross domestic product ratio of less than 60%, and a deficit to GDP ratio of less than 3%. So you needed to make sure that you had only a specific amount of loans that you had in relationship to how much money you produced, how much money your economy produced. So Greece qualifies to join the euro in 2000, and it was officially admitted on January 1st, 2001. So January 1st, 2001, everywhere you went, if you went to a bank, you would give them the Greek currency, and they would take it from you, and they would return euros to you. And so the Greek currency started to go out of circulation on that day. The ability of Greece to enter into the European Union was partly through the creation of complex financial deals that were created by investment banks like Goldman Sachs and others that helped Greece disguise the amount of debt that they actually had. So, disguising your debt is really important, again, because that was one of the conditions to enter into the Eurozone. So, if you want to ever get extra cash, if you're an individual, you take out a second mortgage on a house, or if you don't have a house, maybe you pawn something that you have. These are ways in which you could get extra cash. In the case of a second mortgage, or even in the case of your first mortgage, banks try to find out as much information as possible about you. They look at your credit score, where you work, how long you've worked, how much you get paid, because they want to figure out how much money do you have, can you pay back the loan that it's about to give you. If you were a country, something similar happens, but not exactly the same. If you're a country, you could get private loans from individual creditors, or private loans from transnational corporations. You could also get loans from financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund. And here, your creditworthiness, the creditworthiness of a government, is based on the presumed ability of a government to pay back its debt or its loans every single year. However, it could be easier for countries as opposed to individuals to hide their debt obligations or how much money they have to pay back loans that they took before. And you could try to then interfere in your creditworthiness by trying to kind of fudge the numbers and hide your debt obligations. And in this process, financial firms could help you. So financial firms used creative financial devices such as securitization and currency swaps to hide governments like Greece's liabilities. These are examples of new financial products generating revenue purely through circulation. So securitization is when you take out, for example, one type of securitization is when, for example, a bank that you owe money to. So let's say there are 4 different people, one very rich, one is middle class, and 2 others. And each one of these 4 people took out loans. Maybe one of them is a high risk loan. Maybe 2 of them are very low risk loans. And the bank lent them, all 4 of these people, money. What the bank could then turn and do is to combine these 4 loans into one financial package, or securitize them, and then go to another bank and tell that other bank, or go to another investor and tell that other investor, hey, look, I have this new financial product. It's made up of different loans from different people. Do you want to buy it? And so then that other bank or that other investor could say, you know what, I'm going to buy this loan. And thus, that investor or that bank takes the liability, the risk of whether those four people are gonna be able to pay back that loan or not, and they buy that from that original bank that gave out that loan. And so what's happened is that bank created a new financial product out of the other financial products that it had. The initial financial product that it had was a loan. It gave a loan. Then it put these loans together to create a new type of financial product that it sold to another bank. So that process is called securitization, the creation of this new financial device. So financial firms did certain things like this, much more complicated, of course, in order to hide Greece's debt obligations from the public and from other investors. So Goldman Sachs, for example, was paid $300 million in 2001 for the transaction that is described in a 2010 New York Times article as such. The New York Times article says, quote, in dozens of deals across the continent, here it's talking about Europe, banks provided cash up front in return for government payments in the future, with those liabilities then left off the books. Greece, for example, traded away the right to airport fees and lottery proceeds in years to come. Critics say that such deals, because they are not recorded as loans, mislead investors and regulators about the depth of a country's liabilities. So what it's saying here is one of these types of deals to hide loans was that Greece took cash up front. So it said, hey, give me some money now, and I will pay back this money later. So this money that it got up front now, by getting that money, it could say that it actually has X amount of money more than it actually has. Because before it's indebted, now it has this money and says, okay, I don't have that debt that I used to have. In reality, however, it has to pay this new money back. But what it says is that if I don't pay this money back, then the people who gave me this money, they could get the rights to all the fees that I collect at the airport and all the fees that I collect from the lottery. So that the lottery and airport fees later on are going to go straight to this new investor that gave me money later. In 2002, Goldman Sachs used another financial device called currency swaps to do the same, to push back Greek debt into the future. So it looks like Greece doesn't have any money, doesn't have any loans now, even though it does, it just is going to pop up some years later. This operation in 2002 amounted to approximately $15 billion of bond sales that allowed the government to hide the extent of its deficits. It also helped Greece raise $1 billion without it showing up on its balance sheet. So it got money. These are money that it has to pay back, but it doesn't show up on its balance sheet, so it looks like it's a lot more economically healthy than it actually is. These tactics helped Greece qualify to enter the Eurozone. And in June 2003, the Standard & Poor's rating agency, the S&P rating agency, upgraded Greece's long-term debt from A to A+. This Standard & Poor's is a private company, and one of the things that it does is that it goes and says what the credit worthiness of countries are. So in 2003, the S&P rating agency went and said Greece's credit worthiness is really good, and it upgraded from A to A+. So it's saying to the marketplace, to other investors, if you want to lend to Greece, this is a good thing to do. This is not as risky because Greece has good credit in a sense. So what's happened is that financial firms like Goldman Sachs produced new financial products. And it produced these financial products to hide the amount of loans that Greece had. Then it sold those financial products to other financial firms or other investors in the marketplace. So the producers were financial firms, and the consumers of these financial products were financial firms as well. And then those who regulated this interaction were also private sector financial firms like the S&P, the Standard and Poor's rating agency. So that in this entire operation happens within the marketplace without any kind of government involvement. Those who produce it are financial firms, those who buy the product are financial firms, and those who oversee this process are financial firms as well. Well, everything is going well until 2010. In 2010, Prime Minister George Papandreou announces, he is the former Prime Minister of Greece, he announces that Greece is dangerously close to being insolvent. Basically, he comes out and he says, we might not be able to pay back our loans, and we might not have enough money to keep the government running. At this point, everyone acts shocked. But in reality, if you were paying close attention, it was evident that Greece was going to be in trouble. In 2010, there were debates on whether derivative deals used for creative accounting should be disclosed. In other words, the very financial market and the creditors who govern and run the financial markets were taking advantage of governments' needs to get around debt obligations, only to later demand their money back. So that financial firms were trying to take advantage of governments' attempt to hide their debt obligations, and so they engage those governments by trying to make money out of that process. Then they start to have they get found out and they run into a crisis because what these financial firms were doing was highly risky. Their risk gets found out, and at that point they demand all of their money back, as opposed to being like, well, this was a high risk and I lost my money. At this point in time, that George Papandreou comes out in 2010 and says, hey, we might not have money to pay back our creditors. At this point, there's a fork in the road. There is a decision to be made. According to the former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, he says there's two options. One option is, he says, to restructure the debt and reform the economy. So one option is for the government to tell its creditors, hey, I can't pay your money back. So why don't we engage in negotiations to restructure the debt? So instead of me paying you back all your money back plus interest, maybe I pay you back half of what you paid me. And then in return, what I have to do as the government is to reform my economy and fix the mistakes that I made. And so we both have to do something. We both are gonna lose some money, but we restructure it so that you could get some money back and I could, be able to survive this as the government. So he's like, that's one option. The second option is for a third party to come and give a loan to the government and tell the government to use this loan and pay back the creditors and now pay me back. In other words, Varoufakis says, to extending new loans to a bankrupt entity while pretending that it remains solvent. So that's the choice. The question is, who gets to decide? Who decides which path to take? And here the answer is the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is going to be the one that decides. Well, who is the Eurogroup? The Eurogroup is a grouping of finance ministers of the Eurozone countries. Remember I told you the Eurozone countries were 19 countries. Well, the Eurogroup is a collection of 19 finance ministers of those countries. Finance ministers, these are economic institutions of the state. The leaders of those economic institutions meet as part of the Eurogroup. And the agreements that Greece and the Eurogroup are going to agree to, those agreements are going to be monitored by and carried out by what's called the Troika. The Troika is a collection of three entities: the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. So these three individuals make up the Troika. At the time, the president of the Eurogroup was the Dutch finance minister. The president of the European Central Bank was Mario Draghi, who later on becomes the Italian prime minister. And the director of the International Monetary Fund was Christian Lagarde. The German finance minister, who's going to play an outsized role in these negotiations, was Wolfgang Schäuble. And he is very important because Germany is one of the leading economies in the Eurogroup. Well, to say a little bit more about this Eurogroup, there's something particularly interesting about it, which is that its role is not written in any kind of governing document. So here again, so this is Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. This is the Dutch finance minister. This is Christine Lagarde. And here is the Greek finance minister in 2015, Yanis Varoufakis. So Yanis Varoufakis, in retrospect, in talking about the Eurogroup, he says, quote, "The Eurogroup does not exist in law. There is no treaty which has convened this group." And thus he concludes, so, quote, "So what we have is a non-existent group that has the greatest power to determine the lives of Europeans. It's not answerable to anyone, given that it doesn't exist in law. No minutes are kept, and it's completely confidential, its meetings. So no citizen ever knows what is said within these meetings. These are decisions of almost life and death, and no member has to answer to anybody." So the people who get to say what economic decision, what economic policy gets implemented is the Eurogroup, made up of finance ministers whose roles and responsibilities and power aren't enumerated necessarily in any type of law. And their meetings are not public, and they don't have any obligation to tell the public why they decided to do what they did. So at the time, the EU ambassador to the United States says this about the Greek, what's happening in Greece.
Greece is on the right track, and we are on the right track to support the Greek government, the Greek authorities, the Greek political parties, and the Greek public opinion and the Greek population overcoming this very difficult situation. I think one needs to understand that we are dealing with the aftershocks of the financial crisis. It has affected the whole world, but it has affected some countries more than others, those who had a more vulnerable situation. This is the case of Greece. That's why Greece needs help. That's why we are ready to provide help. We are very happy to see a solidarity of the International Monetary Fund as well. And we are sure with this kind of help, with the efforts that the Greeks have to produce themselves, I think we will come to a solution to this crisis.
Of course, critics say that that the EU approach to Greece has been too focused on cuts and not really enough on economic growth. What would you say to them?
What we want, what Greece wants, what Greek population wants is a sustainable growth. Not 1 year growth or 2 years growth and then 5 or 10 years of recession. No, we want to create the conditions for a sustainable growth pattern in Europe and in Greece in particular. For that to happen, you need to first deal with the emergency situation. And we had a public finances situation in Greece which was unsustainable. We need also to look at the structural reforms, create the conditions for competitiveness for our economies, in this case the Greek economy. Only on that basis can one expect to have sustainable growth in the decades to come.
So what does the Eurogroup decide to do? Well, the Eurogroup pushed an agreement between the Greek government and the Troika on May 3rd, 2010. This agreement was called the First Economic Adjustment Program for Greece. And it was going to later on is going to be followed by two more in 2012 and 2015. The first program, the First Economic Adjustment Program, made available $110 billion euros for Greece, but under strict conditions. There were two main types of conditions. The first condition was that most of this 110 billion euros was to be used to pay back the private creditors who originally lent money to Greece, and that these creditors also included individuals and individual investors, as well as private institutions such as banks and financial firms. So the first condition of this program was, hey, take this money that we're giving you, Greece, and give it back to those investors who gave you money. The second set of conditions for these loans was that Greece had to push through 4 types of measures, commonly referred to as austerity measures. And you should be familiar with these measures because they're very similar to what I described as some of the kind of common policies of neoliberalism. These 4 types of measures included cutting spending on social services and infrastructure spending by the government, privatizing public assets that include public infrastructures such as airports and ports, increasing taxes, raiding pension funds, and increasing the retirement age to generate more revenue, and providing incentives for private sector investments and foreign direct investment through such policies as labor law reforms and other government regulations. Basically, in other words, what the economic adjustment program for Greece said, what the Eurogroup pushed Greece to do, was that it said, here's $110 billion of our money. We're giving it to you. Take this money and go pay back your creditors. And now that you paid back those creditors, now you owe us. So how are you going to pay us back? Well, what you're going to do, Greece, is you're going to cut spending on your social services and your infrastructure spending. So now that you cut your spending, you have more money. Give that money to us to pay back the loan that we gave you so you could give back your creditors' money. Privatize, sell off the stuff that you have. Sell off public assets that you have, and then you take that money and give it to us. Give our money back. Increase taxes. Take money out of money that you set aside for pension funds for your people, and increase the retirement age of your population so that your population works more so that they could pay more taxes. All of that extra taxes and money that you get, then you could use that to give us the money back. Provide incentives to investors. Try to create a more habitable place for global investors to come and set up shop in your country. How do you do that? Well, decrease the regulations you have on labor. Try to get labor to get cheaper so that you get investors to come in. So these are classic neoliberal policy reforms that are pushed on Greece as part of the so-called 2010 bailout reforms. What is called bailouts isn't so much a bailout. What is happening is the money in actuality was a governmental and intergovernmental policy of shifting liability and exposure from private capital to governments. Because what happened was, in reality, the people who were being bailed out were not the Greek people, but rather the creditors. European governments and the Troika were using their own funds to pay back private institutions and investors who loaned Greece money. Now the people on the hook were on the one side Greek citizens who needed to pay back the debts, and on the other side European citizens such as Germans who were footing the bill. Let me say it again in a different way. So what you had was the Eurogroup coming into Greece and telling Greece that we're going to give you $110 billion in 2010 to pay back the creditors. Well, who is the Eurogroup? The Eurogroup is all of these 19 governments, including Greece. These 19 governments are going to take money out of their pocket. Where do these governments make their money? Well, they make their money through taxes of their own population. So these 19 European governments come and tell Greece, we're going to use our taxpayer money to pay you, Greece money, but you have to use this money to give it back to these investors. So now these investors, who were the ones that took on risky loans to Greece, are bailed out. They get their money back. Now they're not losing their money. If Greece goes bankrupt or can't pay its money back, it's okay because these investors got their money back. Now, who's on the hook left? Who's left on the hook? Because these investors are out. We're out of the picture. Now who's on the hook are the Greek citizens, the people of Greece who have to pay back this new loan. And who do they have to pay it back to? To the other European governments who took money from their public coffers. So now the people on the hook are two sets of citizens, Greek citizens and other European citizens. And who's bailed out? Those who made the risky lending, which were these investors. So it is at this point that one group of people are pitted against the other. Politicians and pundits begin to pit people against each other, spreading myths of cultural deficiency. Talking about, the problem with the Greeks is Greek culture. Greece is on the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is always warm and hot and nice, and people just don't work as hard. They're lazier. There's also this culture of corruption. And this is in distinction, of course, to the Germans who live in colder areas. They're a lot more punctual. They're a lot more businesslike. They're a lot more focused. They work harder, as opposed to the Greeks who are lazier. At the time, an American commentator said, he wrote, quote, "The land that invented democracy used it to perfect the art of living at the expense of others." So that the cultural deficiency mantra was repeated so many times that it almost became common sense thinking. They did this survey of European publics about who works the hardest. And all these publics all across different countries were like, oh yeah, the Germans. Except the only people who said the Germans aren't the hardest working were the Greeks. However, of course, this is just mythology. Mythology, because if you look at the data, so this data, this is from Eurostat. If you look at the average age of first pension payment that is received, this is in 2012, the Greeks received their first pension payments at close to age 58, which is close to Italy, UK, kind of close to France. Germany is at 61. So Germans, they retired later. However, if you compare this to the average weekly working hours, the Greeks on average worked 42 hours a week, whereas the Germans worked 35 hours a week. Here's another set of data. Average number of actual weekly hours of work in a main job or in full-time employment. So the number of weekly hours worked in 2013, here's Greece at 40.1. Here's Germany at 40.4. So pretty close to each other. However, if you look at the average collectively agreed normal annual working time, so how much you work per year, here's Greece at around 1,800 hours, and here's Germany at 1,658. So the notion that Germans are hardworking and the Greeks are lazy is fantasy, or it's not substantiated. It's more legend than actual truth. It's mythology propagated to veil or to hide something else that is happening. And that is that what happened in Greece is economic decision makers or economic policy that forces Greece to pay back loans to one set of people as opposed to another set of people. What do I mean by that? Let's go back and consider what's going on in Greece. So in Greece, the Greek government entered into two different contracts. It entered into a contract with its creditors, where some people gave it money, and the Greek government said, okay, we'll pay you back this money plus some interest. So it entered into a contract. It shook hands with these people. But the Greek government has also entered into a different contract, a social contract with its population, where it asked its population to pay it taxes, to give it some money, and in return, the Greek government was going to provide them with certain services. And also, it asked those people to put their money into a pot, into a pension pot. And then later on, when these people were going to age and get old and can't work, the Greek government was going to give them monthly income based off of those pensions. So the Greek government had entered into two contracts, one with these creditors and the other contract with its own public. Then when the Eurogroup comes and says, we're going to give you back money to pay back the creditors, what it's telling the Greek government is you need to prioritize the contract that you had with the creditors at the expense of the contract that you have with your own population. Because the money that it gives them, the so-called bailout, asks the Greek government to use the taxes that it got from its population to increase it and to give that money back for its loans. So that it's telling them the contract that you have with your own population, that doesn't matter as much. What matters more is the contract that you have with the creditors. To put it in other terms, austerity measures, which are the go-to economic policies of neoliberalism, is an attempt to increase government surplus by cutting back expenses and increasing revenues. If we understand public services and pensions as a contract, a social contract, whereby people give the government money in return for the government providing services and helping them in their later years, then austerity measures are in effect the prioritization of the contract signed with creditors, with rich investors, over the social contract signed with the people. Austerity measures then in this case are an abdication of the social contract between the state and its citizens in favor of contracts with the global rich. Because remember, the creditors, the investors, these are not just rich Greeks. These are investors, these are uber rich people from across the world. So rich people from across the world, in this case, are able to get the Greek government to pay back its money to them as opposed to the Greek government paying back money to Greek citizens. The problem with austerity measures, of course, is that once you implement the austerity measures that they were forced to implement in 2010 and later on in 2012, the austerity measures during a period of economic contraction can cause a slowdown of economic activity, leading to decreased government revenues and further limiting its ability to pay back its debt. Because what austerity measures are doing is saying to the government, take money out of the economy. Instead of putting money into the economy, increase taxes and take that money out. Sell off your assets and take that money out. So that process of taking money constantly out of the economy slows the economy down even more. So severe were the austerity measures imposed on Greece that according to leaked IMF minutes of a 2010 meeting, even its staff were already sounding the alarm. Here is a quote from a leaked minutes from an IMF meeting in 2010. It said, quote, an upfront debt restructuring would have been better for Greece, although this was not acceptable to the Euro partners. A delayed debt restructuring also provided a window for private creditors to reduce exposures and shift debt into official hands. So here, the IMF is saying behind closed doors that it's actually better to do some debt restructuring. If we're talking about Greece, it's better to do that. However, if we delay this debt restructuring, we allow creditors, we allow these private investors to either reduce their exposures, try to get out of the Greece of their risky business with Greece, or to shift their exposures, to shift the debt obligations into official hands, to shift it to money coming from another government like Germany, for example. That same leaked documents said, the IMF said, quote, should debt sustainability concerns prove to be weighing on investor sentiments, a more front-loaded approach to debt relief would need to be considered. In other words, here the IMF is saying, okay, here's our plan, and we're going to go with this plan. However, if our plan starts to concern the sentiments of investors, sentiments, feelings, emotions, if investors start to feel scared, if investors start to not like what we as the IMF are doing with Greece, if they're emotionally hurt, at that point, if they start feeling bad, then we'll take another approach. In other words, the sentiments of investors weigh heavily on the decision makers in the IMF. But a similar concern about the feeling of everyday Greek people doesn't weigh on the minds of these IMF decision makers. That nobody's sitting there listening to, well, what are the sentiments of everyday Greeks? The sentiments of global investors, however, is very important. In other words, the IMF is saying that if the investor at some point feels like there should be debt relief to fix the Greek economy, then it will consider debt relief. It is an admission that when it comes to economic policy, the voice of the Greek people or the Greek government is not as important as the demands of the investors. Right? So what happens? Well, look, 2010, the bailouts just forced the Greek government keeps going, and again in 2012 it needs another set of loans. And in 2012 it gets another set of loans to pay back creditors and then to owe the Eurogroup more money. And it keeps going, and in 2015 the same thing happens. They still have a problem. So what happens are all of those street protests that I showed you earlier. Those street protests and those social movements result in an electoral victory for a new kind of coalition of radical left and left parties that comes together. The acronym for that party is Syriza. And so this coalition of these parties called Syriza wins in the election. And it wins in the election because it promises, what Syriza says as part of its electoral campaign is that, hey, we are no longer happy with these bailouts that the Eurogroup is pushing down us. So if you vote for us, we're not going to accept any more bailouts. We're going to re-engage in a different type of negotiations so that we could do something differently with our economy because the bailouts aren't working. And as a result of that political campaign, Syriza is able to come into power. So they take over the Greek government. So what does Syriza do? What Syriza does once it comes into power, it follows along what it promises. So what it does is it goes to the Eurogroup and it says, okay, and this is in 2015, the Eurogroup wants to push another set of bailouts on Greece. The Syriza party says, well, why don't we put this to a vote? And so they put together a referendum where they ask the population, where they ask Greek people, hey, do you want us to accept another bailout, or do you want us to engage in a new type of negotiation? Right? So they put in a referendum and they say, okay, let everybody vote for it. And then let's see what happens. So the Syriza government puts the bailouts to a referendum, to a vote. Right as the elections are coming up, this is what happens.
Greek pensioners lined up outside banks, desperate to access their monthly payouts. With banks closed until after a referendum on bailout proposals, cash withdrawals from ATMs have been limited to €60. Pensions were supposed to be exempt from capital controls, but conflicting information has left some frustrated with the government's actions. We're waiting for our pensions that we've been working for our whole lives, and they're fooling us, and we're waiting here like beggars to withdraw our own money, the fruits of our labour. This is what we're waiting for, and they're fooling us. They're keeping us outside. No one has come out to inform us. The TV channels are now saying one thing, and in an hour they say something else. They're driving us crazy, everyone.
What's happening here is that in the lead up to the elections, the European Central Bank cut the money that it sends to Greek banks, which forced the Greek banks to close. When the Greek banks close, then these people who are going to the banks to draw out their monthly salaries, these pensioners, there's no money to draw out. So this is then the anger that you're seeing. In other words, the European Central Bank is threatening the voters in Greece that if you vote with the Syriza party against the bailouts, then this could be your future.
Of course we're worried. I'm not so heartless as to not be worried. Everyone is worried. But I'm expecting worse to come. Despite the breakdown of talks over the weekend, EU officials are continuing efforts to salvage a deal with Athens. Anti-austerity demonstrators are expected to continue protests outside Parliament, with a pro-Europe demo scheduled for Tuesday, as the country hurtles towards a default and a possible Eurozone exit.
The European Central Bank is intimidating voters in effect in Greece. Now, it's, in the run-up to the election. So the election happens. This is what happens the night of the elections, the night after the election is over.
There was quite some celebration in central Athens tonight. Greece's no voters felt proud of themselves. Like their controversial prime minister, they stood up today to their country's powerful creditors, the IMF and the European Union. After 5 years of hopeless austerity misery, their message was clear. No more. But what now?
I don't know what is going to my country tomorrow. I don't know. I hope they come to a compromise, but I don't know.
No money,
There's no money, but little by little we'll be okay. We're hungry before, and now we'll stay hungry. But at least we stood up today to Angela Merkel.
The no voters here in Syntagma Square are delighted to have got their voice of protest heard. But behind the music and the celebration is a sense of confusion and of fear. Whatever Greeks voted today, yes or no, the vast majority say they want to stay inside the Eurozone. But will that be possible? Greek banks are shut and fast running out of money, and no one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Television coverage of the referendum here was as self-conscious as it was dramatic. Greeks know the rest of Europe is watching, with bated breath. The impact of today's vote will be felt not only in Greece, but throughout the Eurozone. Buoyed by the backing of their people, which they say strengthens their bargaining position, the Greek government now is upbeat about finding a new bailout deal.
With this no, we will try to cooperate with our partners, and we will invite them one by one to see if we can find some common ground, and we will try to be positive. As of tomorrow, Greece will go back to the negotiation tables, and our primary priority is to reinstate the financial stability of the country.
But is that realistic? Or are Greeks celebrating the no vote tonight, dancing on the edge of a precipice? Greece now has to wait for the reaction of its Eurozone partners. It could just have taken a big step closer to falling out of the single currency.
What happened is the Syriza was able to win the referendum by something like 60% or so. And so then basically now the strategy was, or what Syriza intended to do, was to go back to the Eurogroup and tell the Eurogroup, hey, we asked the population, we asked the Greek citizens do you want us, the government, to sign another bailout agreement with the Eurogroup? Or do you want us to enter into a new set of negotiations that could give, with the hope of trying to get a different type of agreement? And so we did that, and the Greek population said no to bailouts and yes to another set of negotiations. So now we're here to you. Given that we're all democratic countries, we asked our people, this is what they told us. And as the government, we are trying to represent our population, and so we ask you to enter into a different type of negotiations with us. That was the thinking of the Syriza party. So they vote for this referendum. The people tell them, yes, go for a different set of negotiations. Don't go for a new set of bailouts. Literally the next day after that elections, this is what happens.
Greece's outspoken finance minister has resigned. Yanis Varoufakis announced he will step down just one day after Greeks voted no to austerity bailout measures. The frontrunner to replace him, seen here carrying the red folder, is Greece's chief negotiator with international lenders, Evklidis Sakalotos. A brief message on Varoufakis' Twitter account was followed up with a statement explaining that he had been made aware that some Eurozone members considered him unwelcome at meetings of finance ministers. He added, "I shall wear the creditors' loathing with pride." Varoufakis' successor was expected to be confirmed after a meeting of Greek political leaders. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, under pressure over Greece's future in the Eurozone, plans to meet French President François Hollande later today in Paris. As the Greek president sat down with party leaders, analysts with several major banks said a Greek exit from the Eurozone was now the most likely scenario.
So what happened is, here's the Greek population. They say one thing. The Eurogroup returns and says to the Greek government, doesn't matter, we don't care. You're going to enter into into another bailout. Doesn't matter what the population said. Not only does it not matter, we want your finance minister out because we just don't like him in these negotiations. Get somebody else to join the negotiations. We don't want to deal with this guy. And the Greek government is forced to go along with that. As a result of this, the government of Greece is forced to enter into a new bailout agreement in 2015. And as a result of that, they needed to again sell off a bunch of assets, deregulate their labor markets, increase taxes, increase the retirement age. They took out a bunch of money from their pension funds. And they did all of these things that they were forced to do by the Eurogroup. And just a couple of years later, this is one of the impacts, the consequences of that 2015 bailout, which was the third bailout since 2010. So 3 bailouts in 5 years.
For hundreds of years, farmers on Chios have cut the barks of mastica trees and watched the sticky resin bleed out. Chios is the only place in the world where mastica gum is successfully collected. So they have a global monopoly. Dozens and dozens of things are made from it. Food, drinks, soft and hard, cosmetics, medicinal aids. They sell it all over the world.
It's protecting the mastica penetration.
Yeah. And it's a good thing the export markets are growing, because at home their sales have tanked.
We lost about 30 to 40% of our growth, of our corporate growth.
Over the last, 10 years or so?
Yes. That means that we had, in order to replace this loss, we had to work more on exports.
So what you just heard him say is that because of the slowdown in the economy, their local consumers are no longer able to buy or consume this product. So now they are forced to sell externally. And so what this is what happens is a reorientation here of the Greek economy away from meeting its local demand to attempt to meet external demand.
Just down the road from the mastica farm, Iakovos employs 5 people in the micro brewery he established in 2012. 30% growth every year, his beer selling all over Greece.
100,000 euros.
But look at his figures. He and his partner split a profit of 100,000 euros last year. But there's 26% social security, 29% company tax, 6% personal tax, and after all that, 14% advance tax for next year. They're each left with €1,000 a month because they've paid 75% tax.
And for this profit, we have to work 7 days per week sometimes. We have to work 12 hours per day. In summertime, we have every day is 12 hours per day. So we don't know what to do now. Because for this to change...
You're being punished for being a successful entrepreneur.
Yes.
Greece has just returned to the bond markets to borrow more, having apparently proved its financial maturity by raising more and more tax from the people. The Prime Minister says the bad days are over, but very many Greeks say that is the opposite of the truth. Up until around 2005, Greek debt levels were basically stable, running at about 100% of the country's annual income, or GDP. And yet since the crash, and despite everything that Greece has done to try to reassure the financial markets, the debt has gone up and up and up, and it's now almost double Greece's GDP. And all the while, Greeks are being taxed into poverty. The authorities employ tax police to check that shops and businesses issue receipts as proof of sale so they don't avoid paying tax. Those caught risk heavy fines. The old myth about lazy Greeks not paying their taxes has never looked more wrong. The trouble is, it isn't fixing Greece's broken economy.
So you saw some of the impacts of the 2015 bailouts and those 3 bailouts over 5 years. Here in 2016, Alexis Tsipras, the Greek prime minister at the time, said this, quote, "Unemployment in Greece stands at 28%, which is at 60% for young people. The average income has decreased by 40%. Public debt has gone from 120% of GDP before the bailouts to 180% of GDP. Much of Greek assets have been sold at rock bottom prices to global investors. All of this was done through pressure from an unaccountable group who, through bailout agreements, has oversight over the Greek economy, effectively sidelining its own government." So again, what we've seen happen is that certain economic institutions were able, and here the economic institution I'm talking about is the Eurogroup. This Eurogroup was an independent institution outside of the state. By that I mean outside of the ability of regular everyday people to put pressure on it. You cannot vote out the Eurogroup, so that the Eurogroup was able to put pressure on a government like Greece to take on or to make certain economic decisions. The economic decisions that it put pressure on the government of Greece to take were to the benefit not of other governments, not of the Greek government, not of other citizens, not of Greek citizens, but rather in the interests of global investors, of global markets. Now, so that global investors were able to push through their economic and their political interests in a place like Greece through the global sets of institutions that make the markets able to discipline states like Greece. Look what these neoliberals will say is that economic decision making is not the terrain for democracy. This is not where people are able to come and make a decision, because this needs to be left to those who know those things, those who understand economics, those who understand the marketplace. These are not my words. These are the words that these folks actually said. So let me play you a video, which is a kind of an edited video of visit from the German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble and Yanis Varoufakis, who both visited the Brookings Institution in the United States in the run-up to the referendum in 2015. And this is what the German finance minister, one of those who was really keen on forcing the Greek government to enter into the bailouts. This is what Wolfgang Schäuble said.
In Europe, we have good reason not to provide financial assistance without demanding something in return. And we do not provide help if a country doesn't use it to help itself. A lot of people underestimate the problem of moral hazard. But if you separate decision-making power from accountability, and if you separate opportunity from risk, you can't succeed. Debt relief and permanent transfers wouldn't solve a single structural problem. They would weaken the incentives to carry out reforms. And they would create a problem of moral hazard in political terms, namely the experience and expectations that others will bear the cost of a country's own actions or failure to act.
So he says that, look, if you allow them to reform their debt or to restructure the debt, then they, and by this he means the Greek people, the Greek government, will never learn its lesson and will then do the same things. And so if they made mistakes, then they need to be held to its consequence. Now, Wolfgang Schäuble, what he doesn't say is the same thing for the investors. Because the investors also decided to risk money and invest in Greece. So but they, on the other hand, don't have to face the consequences. But here's the key point that I want you to listen to.
As long as you give them buyouts, you will never get the hard decisions you have to take. And that is what I call, any democratic system, in my long experience, tends to take the more comfortable decision if you have the alternative to do so.
Let's listen to that one more time, because I think it's such a key point. What he is saying to you, he is being very honest. He says, these are economic decisions that you cannot decide democratically. Because he says, in my experience, letting people decide on these economic decisions will result in the wrong decision from his perspective. Listen to it again.
As you give them buyouts, you will never get the hard decisions you have to take. And that is what I call, any democratic system, in my long experience, tends to take the more comfortable decision if you have the alternative to do.
So again, this is, when it comes to the economic decisions, this is not the terrain for democracy. When it comes to economic decisions, when it comes to these very difficult economic decisions, this is not where you come and ask people what they should do. So that he is arguing that when it comes to important economic decisions, these decisions need to be made by somebody else. That economic decision making should not be the purview of democratic decision making processes. Thus, those economic decisions, those economic institutions that are in charge of those economic decisions should be put outside of the terrain of the state, outside of the terrain of political accountability by the citizenry of those different states. Let us pose this question in this way. If in a democracy, the people are the sovereign, or they are the ones who rule, and if to rule is defined as the power to make change, and if change is increasingly occurring in the economic realm, then an economic realm is where people cannot decide, and they are not the sovereign, because that is not the realm of democracy. Then who is the new sovereign? Who is the new ruler within our democracy? And here is where, based off of the Greek case, where what we could say is that we are seeing something that we've talked about in this class before, which is that there is a separation between the political and the economic. And that separation between the political and economic is becoming more and more enshrined in both political and economic policies. And that when we talk about democracy, where only equality in the political realm is guaranteed by law. Access to one is to all of those things. Access to the other is limited. By that I mean, if you are a citizen, you have access to political rights and political power, but you do not have access to economic rights or economic power. However, if you are an investor, your sentiments matter. If you are an investor, you have a say in economic policies. If you're an investor, and even if you feel something, then economic institutions respond to your feelings. If you demand something, then economic institutions will respond to you. So that if you are an investor, you have access to economic rights and you have economic power that citizens don't have. And as a result of you having economic power, you as the investor could push for political changes as well. So that a full citizen, if we really think about it, a full citizen ought to have both political and economic power. A full citizen should be a political subject and an economic subject. However, in the contemporary time, a citizen barely has political power, but has no economic power. Whereas the investor who might not even live in that country or hold the passport to that country or have any kind of citizenship claim to that country could have economic power and political power in that country. So you could be an American and if you are this part of this global investor class, you could have more say in what happens in Greece than a Greek voter. So at that point, the question is, who's the real citizen here? And what is important then to understand is that what we are starting to see is that instead of democracy, what we really have is polyarchy. Polyarchy is the institutionalization of the separation between the economic and the political. A polyarchy is different than a democracy. A democracy, everybody has an ability to decide what happens economically and politically. You get to decide on your future. You get to have a say in the decision-making process that has an impact on your life. In a polyarchy, you get to vote between competing elites. For polyarchy, what is important is you getting a say in a voting process. You get to vote. That's it. That's what a polyarchy is. So you get to decide between political elites. And within polyarchy, economic decisions are then separate, or there is a separation between the economic and the political. So you get to have a say in terms of which elites control here, the politics. What you don't get a say in is what happens here economically. And so then the question is, in today's world, who is the sovereign? At some point, the sovereign used to be the king. Here's the king. At some point, the sovereign was a fascist ruler. At some point, the sovereign was, these people who come out and vote. At some point, the sovereign becomes maybe the investor. So the question is, who's the sovereign here? Is it a king? Is it an authoritarian ruler? Is it the people? Or is it these investors? And so that's the question that I propose to you. Who is the sovereign if we take the case of Greece seriously? And the question that I want, that the Greek people, I think, asked all of us in 2015 is the same question that this French protester is asking, which is, will anybody listen and care to listen to the rage of the people? Thank you very much.